They called him a monster, a devil in human form, but behind the name Dracula, the blood-soaked legend, was a man born from betrayal, shaped by war and driven by one consuming desire to protect his land, even if it meant becoming the very thing he feared most. Tonight, we travel back 5 centuries into the dark heart of medieval Wallachia, where one man's thirst for vengeance and justice blurred the line between hero and horror. Was he a tyrant, or a savior the world refused to understand? This is the true story of Vlad the Impaler, the man who became Dracula. The night sky above the Carpathian Mountains was painted in black and silver, the moonlight slicing through the mist like a blade. Wolves howled from the forests, their cries echoing through the valley as a small caravan of horses trudged through the mud. In the center of them, bound in chains, rode a boy, barely 13, with eyes that gleamed brighter than the torches surrounding him. His name was Vlad Dracula, son of Vlad Dracul, the ruler of Wallachia. But to the soldiers escorting him, he was no prince. He was a hostage. The Ottomans had demanded loyalty from his father, and loyalty came in the form of his sons. Vlad and his younger brother Radu were taken deep into foreign lands, far from the castles and mountains of their home. The boy who once played among the pine trees now found himself inside the stone walls of Edirne, the capital of the Ottoman Empire, a world of silk, prayer calls, and watchful eyes. He was surrounded by enemies who called his people barbarians. At first, he resisted everything, the language, the customs, the religion. But Vlad was not foolish. He learned quickly that survival was its own form of rebellion. While Radu softened under the kindness of their captors, finding comfort in luxury and in the Sultan's court, Vlad hardened. Every lesson he was forced to learn, every humiliation he suffered, became a spark in the fire building inside him. He studied war tactics, swordsmanship, and diplomacy, not to serve his captors, but to destroy them one day. Late at night, he would whisper to his brother, "They think they've caged us, Radu, but I am only waiting. One day I'll return home, and the world will remember my name." Radu would turn away, too afraid to answer, too afraid to believe. Years passed, and news arrived that their father, Vlad Dracul, had been betrayed and killed, his body left to rot, his eldest son buried alive by Wallachian nobles who had sided with Hungary and the Ottomans. The betrayal carved something cold into Vlad's heart. He was no longer a boy. The innocence that once existed inside him was burned away by grief. He swore that those who had murdered his family and sold his country's freedom for gold would pay in blood. When he was finally released, he returned to Wallachia, a land broken by fear, corruption, and war. The Ottoman shadow had grown long. Nobles had divided the kingdom, and foreign armies marched through its villages. Vlad looked upon his homeland and saw not the beauty of the Carpathians, but the sickness of greed that had infested it. He had been raised in captivity, but it was his own people who were truly enslaved. He bided his time. In 1456, through cunning alliances and sheer will, he reclaimed the throne of Wallachia. But he did not enter as a triumphant prince. He entered as a storm. The nobles who had betrayed his father he invited to a great feast, a celebration, he called it, of unity and loyalty. The banquet overflowed with wine and laughter, the sound of lutes echoing through the hall. Yet as the nobles toasted his name, Vlad watched them with unblinking eyes. When the final cup was emptied, his soldiers moved in. The laughter turned to screams. Those who had betrayed the crown were impaled, long wooden stakes piercing their bodies and hoisted high above the castle walls. The morning sun rose over a forest of corpses, a warning to every man who thought to betray him. From that day, Vlad was no longer merely a ruler. He was a force. Justice, he believed, was only as strong as the fear it inspired. To his people, he brought order. Thieves were hunted down, corruption punished. The roads became safe again, the markets thrived. But peace had a terrible cost. To the neighboring kingdoms, to the Turks, to the Hungarians, Vlad became something else entirely. They whispered stories of the Impaler Prince, the man who skewered thousands of men, women and soldiers on stakes. They said he dined among the dying, that he drank their blood from golden goblets. The name Dracula, meaning son of the dragon, began to twist into Dracul, the devil. Yet behind the horror was logic. The Ottomans, who had enslaved Christian nations for centuries, feared one thing more than armies: terror. And Vlad understood this better than any man. When an Ottoman envoy arrived demanding tribute, Vlad asked them to remove their turbans as a sign of respect. They refused, saying it was their custom never to do so. Vlad smiled and ordered the turbans nailed to their heads. He returned their bodies to the Sultan with a message: Wallachia kneels to no one. Soon after, Ottoman scouts who crossed into his land vanished. The few who returned told tales of endless stakes, each carrying a body, soldiers, spies and traitors alike, impaled along the roads like dark trees reaching toward the heavens. The Sultan called it barbarity, the peasants called it protection, and Vlad called it necessary. But even as he wielded fear like a sword, shadows began to gather around him. His own council began to question his methods. They said he had gone too far, that his thirst for vengeance had consumed him. Vlad ignored them. He had seen what mercy brought: his father's death, his people's suffering. He would not make that mistake again. At night, alone in his chambers, he would sometimes stand by the window, staring out at the mist-covered fields. He remembered his childhood, his mother's voice, his father's stern gaze, his brother's laughter. But those memories felt like dreams now, belonging to another life. He touched the scars on his hands and whispered, "They call me a monster, but monsters keep the wolves away." In 1462, word reached him that the Sultan Mehmed II, the same man who had once held him captive, was leading a vast army toward Wallachia. Over 100,000 soldiers marched under the crescent moon, determined to crush the man who had defied the empire. Vlad knew he could not face them in open battle, but he did not need to. He had the land, the mountains, and the darkness itself. He ordered villages burned, wells poisoned, fields destroyed. His people hid in the forests, while his soldiers struck from the shadows, ambushing caravans, slaughtering scouts, vanishing into the night. It was not war, it was horror. And when the Ottoman army finally reached the capital, Târgoviște, they found silence. The wind carried the smell of rot. Then in the pale dawn light they saw it. Thousands upon thousands of corpses impaled across the valley, stretching as far as the eye could see. Over 20,000 bodies, some still twitching, their faces frozen in agony. Even Mehmed, conqueror of Constantinople, could not bear the sight. He turned his army back. Vlad had won, but victory did not bring peace. It brought emptiness. The people he had protected began to fear him more than the invaders. His brother Radu, once soft and obedient to the Sultan, now returned with Turkish support to take his throne. Betrayed yet again, Vlad was captured and imprisoned by the very allies he once trusted. And as he sat in the darkness of his cell, the man who had turned fear into a weapon was left with nothing but silence and the faint echo of the question that had haunted him all his life. Had he saved his people, or had he damned them all? The years in captivity aged Vlad beyond his time. The dungeon walls that once echoed with his rage eventually absorbed his silence. Yet even in chains, his spirit refused to die. He had lived through betrayal, humiliation, and exile. He had watched his family slaughtered and his people enslaved. And now, as he sat in the damp cold, surrounded by shadows and rats, one thought still burned in his heart, like an eternal flame. Wallachia must never kneel again. Outside, the world changed. Empires rose and fell. Radu, his younger brother, ruled Wallachia under Ottoman control, his throne bought with obedience. The nobles who once feared Vlad now whispered that the Impaler had been forgotten. But the common people, those who had lived under his rule, told stories in secret, Stories of a prince who had brought justice, who had made thieves disappear and invaders tremble. Parents warned their children, "Obey the law or Dracula will come for you." The name that foreign lands cursed became in Wallachia a name of protection. Then one winter morning, word came to Vlad's cell. The Ottomans were marching north again, burning villages, enslaving men, and desecrating churches. The Christian kingdoms trembled, desperate for someone ruthless enough to face the Sultan's army. And so, in a bitter twist of irony, they turned to the man they had once called a monster. Vlad was released. He emerged from prison thin and pale, his hair streaked with grey, but his eyes, sharp as a wolf's, had lost none of their fire. As he stepped out into the sunlight for the first time in years, he looked toward the east, toward his homeland, and whispered, "I am coming home." Vlad! When he crossed into Wallachia once more, the air seemed to hold its breath. The peasants who saw him ride through the villages dropped to their knees. Some wept, others fled. His reputation had become larger than life. A ghost story whispered for generations, now returned in the flesh. They said the devil himself had walked out of the grave. But Vlad was not a ghost. He was a man, older, colder, but still driven by the same purpose, to defend his land from the jaws of the empire that had stolen his childhood. He found his country, broken again, the nobles divided, the peasants starving, the soldiers untrained. Radu had died, and the Ottomans had installed another puppet ruler. Corruption flowed through every corner of the land. Vlad gathered the remnants of his loyalists, men who still remembered his iron rule, and began to rebuild. He rode from village to village, speaking not as a king but as one of them. "You call me a tyrant," he said to the frightened faces before him, "but who else has ever kept you safe? Who else has made the invaders fear your name?" His words, though hard as steel, carried truth. Slowly, the people began to rally. Farmers took up pitchforks, blacksmiths forged weapons, and exiled soldiers returned to his side. The old fire of Wallachia began to burn again. War followed quickly. The Ottomans, enraged by his defiance, sent thousands of troops to crush him. But Vlad no longer fought with rage. He fought with strategy. He had learned patience in his years of imprisonment. He knew when to strike and when to vanish. His army, though smaller, moved like shadows through the forests. They ambushed Ottoman camps, cut off supply routes, and struck under the cover of night. He turned the mountains into fortresses, the rivers into traps. He was no longer merely a prince. He was a phantom of vengeance. Yet, as victories mounted, so too did the myths. Foreign travelers spread stories more terrifying than ever before. They said Vlad impaled entire armies, that he bathed in blood to keep his youth, that he fed on the living. Pamphlets printed in the cities of Germany and Italy portrayed him as a demon with fangs and claws. The legend of Dracula was born, not as a hero, but as a monster. Still, Vlad fought on. When his soldiers faltered, he reminded them of the stakes. If we fall, our sons will serve the Sultan, our daughters will fill his harems, and our churches will burn. If fear keeps the enemy away, then let them fear me. And they did. But victory came at a cost he could no longer ignore. The bloodshed weighed on him. He no longer found satisfaction in his enemies' screams. The boy who once dreamed of saving his country had become the very image of the terror he despised. At night, when the fires dimmed and the forest grew quiet, he sat alone and stared into the flames. His reflection danced in the red glow, a face weathered by war, eyes hollow from years of vengeance. Sometimes he thought he saw the faces of those he'd killed staring back at him, asking if this was truly the freedom he had promised. The final blow came not from the Ottomans, but from within. Betrayal once again sealed his fate. Some of his own allies, tired of living under constant blood and fear, conspired against him. When word reached Vlad that the enemy was approaching, he rode into battle with only a handful of loyal men. The fighting was fierce, chaotic, steel against steel, the clash echoing through the forest. Vlad fought like a man possessed, cutting through ranks of enemies until his sword broke in half. Surrounded, bleeding, and outnumbered, he refused to surrender. He swung the broken blade until his arms failed him, until he was buried beneath the weight of bodies. When the battle ended, they found him among the dead, his armor torn, his chest pierced by a dozen blades. His head was severed and sent to the Sultan as proof that the devil had been slain. But death did not end his story. Weeks later, travelers passing through the battlefield claimed to see a figure standing atop a hill at dusk, a man in black armor, pale as the moon, watching silently over the land he died to defend. Others swore they heard his voice in the wind whispering through the trees, "Wallachia is free." The world would go on to remember him not as Vlad the Prince, but as Dracula, the creature of the night, a symbol of eternal hunger, of darkness feeding upon the living. Yet behind the myth was a truth history could never erase. Vlad the Impaler had been both hero and monster, savior and executioner. He was a man shaped by betrayal and bound by love for his people, a man who chose fear because kindness had failed him, a man who became legend because he refused to bow. Centuries later, the name Dracula would haunt books, films, and nightmares. But if you walk the forests of Romania on a quiet night, when the fog rolls down from the mountains and the wind carries the scent of pine and smoke, some say you can still feel him there. Not the vampire of stories, but the prince who loved his land too fiercely to ever truly die. Because heroes are remembered, but legends never rest. The mist hung low over the Transylvanian hills, curling around the broken ruins of what was once a proud fortress. Centuries had passed since Vlad's death, yet the land still whispered his name. Travelers spoke of strange lights flickering among the stones at night, of horses refusing to cross certain roads, and of the haunting sound of a man's voice carried by the wind. His castle, Poenari, now stood as a skeleton of its former glory, but the villagers below still crossed themselves when they looked up at it. To them, it was not just a ruin, it was a wound that never healed. Vlad's body was gone, his grave unmarked and unknown. Some said the monks buried him in a monastery near Snagov Lake. Others swore the Ottomans dumped his remains into the waters to hide what they feared could not die. But wherever he rested, his legend did not. The name Dracula began to drift beyond Wallachia's borders, carried by merchants and soldiers, scholars and priests, each adding their own color to the story. In German towns, they printed pamphlets of horror, tales of the Impaler who skewered thousands and drank their blood beneath the full moon. In Italy, they painted him as the devil's general. To Western Europe, he became a symbol of cruelty so monstrous that even hell itself would hesitate to claim him. Yet in the small villages of Romania, old women still lit candles at night and whispered, "He was cruel, yes, but he kept the wolves from our doors." Time, however, has a way of twisting truth. By the 1800s, centuries after Vlad's reign, his name had all but faded from history's pages, until an Irish writer named Bram Stoker stumbled upon the legend while researching Eastern Europe. The name Dracula caught his imagination, its sound sharp and dangerous. He borrowed it, molded it, and gave it new life, turning the Wallachian prince into an immortal vampire who fed on the living. Stoker's Dracula was not the soldier, not the ruler, not the man who fought empires. He was a creature of darkness, seductive and evil, cursed to wander the night. The world loved the myth. Books, plays, and films followed. Count Dracula became a symbol of terror, of forbidden desire, of death that would not die. Yet with every retelling, the truth of Vlad the Impaler sank deeper into the shadows. The man who once impaled enemies to protect his people was now imagined as a monster who impaled victims for pleasure. The prince who had sacrificed his humanity for his homeland became a creature stripped of it entirely. But perhaps there was something fitting about that transformation, because Vlad had always lived between two worlds, the hero and the horror, the savior and the beast. Even as the myth grew, there were those who sought to uncover the truth. Historians traveled to the ruins of his castles, digging through ancient records and forgotten letters. What they found painted a far more complex picture than the tales of monsters. They discovered a ruler surrounded by betrayal, born into chaos, and forced to defend a land caught between two great powers, the Ottoman Empire and the Kingdom of Hungary. They found evidence of reforms, of laws meant to protect peasants and punish corruption. They found accounts of how merchants could travel safely through Wallachia under his rule, of how no thief dared steal for fear of his justice. One story told of a golden cup placed by a public fountain in the city of Târgoviște. Anyone could drink from it, yet no one ever stole it. Not because they didn't want to, but because they knew what would happen if they did. For all his brutality, Vlad had brought order, a kind of peace born not from love, but from fear. The question that haunted historians was simple yet impossible to answer. Was he truly a monster, or was he made into one by the world around him? The deeper they searched, the more they realized that Vlad's cruelty had been a mirror, reflecting the violence of his age. The 15th century was not an age of mercy. Empires rose on blood and conquest. The Ottomans impaled rebels, the Hungarians burned witches, the church waged holy wars. Yet only Vlad's name endured as the embodiment of terror. Perhaps because he was not content to be a victim of history, he forced himself to become its weapon.